Amina was a young woman from Kasongo, a small town in Tanzania, where life was simple but full of dreams. She had always believed in love, and when she met Daniel, she felt her heart had finally found its home. Their wedding was the happiest day of her life. She was certain that their love would only grow stronger with time, and she carried with her the sweet hope of building a family filled with warmth, laughter, and care. Not long after the wedding, Amina's joy deepened when she discovered she was pregnant. She touched her stomach every day, whispering little prayers for the child inside her. She imagined tiny feet running through the courtyard, the sound of a baby's laughter filling the air, and the peace of rocking her child to sleep under the starlit Kasongo sky. To her, this pregnancy was not just a blessing, but the beginning of the family she had always dreamed about. Daniel too was excited, though quieter in his way, and Amina felt safe in his love. She believed they would face every challenge together. With her heart overflowing, she told herself that nothing could shake her happiness. But life has a way of testing even the strongest dream. Just as Amina was beginning to settle into her new role as a wife and expectant mother, an unexpected storm rose within the very home she had entered with so much hope. That storm was Daniel's mother, Mama Rahima, a woman whose heart carried shadows that Amina had not yet seen. When Amina moved into Daniel's family home after their wedding, her heart was full of hope. She thought she was entering a place where she would be welcomed as a daughter, where she and Daniel could begin their new life surrounded by love. She wanted to learn, to respect traditions, and to be part of this family that meant so much to the man she loved. But the moment she stepped into that house, she felt the coldness in Mama Rahima's eyes. It was as if every smile Amina offered, every gentle word she spoke, was being measured and found lacking. At first, Amina tried to convince herself it was only her imagination. She thought maybe Mama Rahima simply needed time to accept her. But the truth became clear quickly. Mama Rahima did not see her as good enough for Daniel. She criticized everything, from the way Amina cooked to the way she dressed, even down to how she walked across the yard. Nothing seemed right in her eyes. If the stew was a little too salty, Mama Rahima would complain loudly. If Amina wore her favorite dress, Mama Rahima would scoff that it looked cheap. Each remark cut deep, though Amina kept her head down and forced a smile. Daniel noticed the tension, but he didn't know how to respond. He loved both women and chose silence, hoping the storm would pass. Sometimes he would hold Amina's hand and tell her to ignore his mother's harshness. But ignoring was easier said than done. Every day felt like a test Amina was failing. The home that should have been a safe place instead became a stage where she was constantly judged. At night, when Daniel was asleep, Amina would lie awake with tears soaking her pillow. She thought of her own mother's warm embrace, of the laughter in her family's home, and wondered why her new life felt so heavy. She asked herself if she had done something wrong, if she was truly unworthy of the love she had been given. Yet in the morning, she rose again with quiet strength, determined not to let her pain show. She carried her suffering inside, alone, because she wanted to protect Daniel from choosing between his wife and his mother. In her heart, she prayed that things would change, that one day Mama Rahima would see her not as a stranger who had stolen her son, but as a woman who loved him deeply and wanted nothing but peace. Until then, Amina endured in silence, believing that love, no matter how battered, was still strong enough to carry her through. Amina thought pregnancy would bring her joy and protection, but instead it became the time she felt most vulnerable. Her body was changing, her energy often low, and yet the harsh words from Mama Rahima only grew sharper. Each morning, before she could even gather her strength, she was ordered to fetch water, sweep the compound, and carry heavy firewood. Even when Amina felt dizzy or weak, Mama Rahima would accuse her of being lazy. "Women in this house don't rest," she would say coldly, as if Amina's growing belly was not proof enough of her hard work. The insults came daily. If Amina prepared food, Mama Rahima would complain that it had no taste. If Amina sat down to rest for a moment, she was told she was behaving like a queen in another woman's home. These words pierced her deeply, but Amina kept silent, hoping patience would soften her mother-in-law's heart. She told herself that kindness would eventually win, even as her spirit quietly broke. The pain grew sharper when guests came to visit. Instead of showing unity as a family, Mama Rahima used those moments to humiliate her. She would talk loudly about Daniel's ex-girlfriend, praising her beauty, her cooking, and how she would have been a better wife. Amina sat quietly, forcing a smile while her heart sank. She felt invisible, as though she were not a wife carrying her husband's child, but an unwanted outsider constantly being compared to someone else. Daniel would shift uncomfortably during these moments, but his silence only made her feel more alone. The neighbors noticed the tension. They saw Amina working in the hot sun with her swollen feet, carrying loads that no pregnant woman should carry. They heard the sharp words Mama Rahima spoke. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in pity, but no one stepped in. The house that should have been her safe place felt more like a prison, and the community around her offered no escape. At night, Amina would cradle her stomach and whisper to her unborn child, promising to protect it no matter how much pain she endured. She prayed for strength, telling herself that her child's arrival would one day bring light into the darkness surrounding her. Yet in her quiet heart, she wondered how long she could survive this storm of insults and neglect. Still, she rose each morning with determination, carrying both her child and her silent suffering. She knew she had no one to lean on, but she held on to the hope that her love for Daniel and her unborn baby would be enough to keep her going, even as the first scars of abuse began to leave their mark on her soul. One hot afternoon, Amina was carrying a heavy container of water from the well. Her back ached, her feet were swollen, and every step felt like a struggle. She told herself she could manage, that she had to keep going, but her body finally gave up. The world spun around her, and before she knew it, she collapsed onto the ground. For a moment, she thought she might lose her baby. Instead of rushing to her side, Mama Rahima stood over her with a look of disgust. "Weak," she spat, shaking her head. "How will you raise a child if you cannot even carry water?" Her words were like stones thrown at an already broken spirit. Amina wanted to cry, not just from the pain in her body, but from the cruelty in her mother-in-law's voice. She wished for Daniel's arms to lift her, to remind her she was not alone, but Daniel was not there. When he returned later, she told him what had happened, hoping for comfort. But instead of anger toward his mother, he grew distant. He told Amina she needed to be stronger, that his mother had only spoken the truth. Each word from him cut deeper than Mama Rahima's insults. The man who once swore to protect her was slowly slipping away, his loyalty tilting toward his mother. Amina felt the space between them widening, and it frightened her more than anything. Days turned into weeks, and her health continued to weaken. She often felt dizzy, and her body craved rest, yet she forced herself to keep moving. If she showed any sign of pain, she feared Mama Rahima would call her lazy again, or worse, Daniel would agree. So she hid her suffering. She carried water, bent over in the fields, and cooked for the family, even when her hands trembled from exhaustion. At night, when no one could see, she would sit on the edge of her bed, pressing her hands against her belly, whispering to the child inside her. "Hold on," she murmured. "I am strong enough for both of us." Tears often blurred her vision, but she wiped them away quickly. She wanted her baby to feel love, not sadness, even if the world around her offered only cruelty. The house felt darker each day. Amina noticed Daniel's eyes avoiding hers, his conversations growing shorter. She wondered if he even saw her pain anymore, or if his mother's harsh words had drowned out her voice completely. The warmth that once filled their marriage was fading, leaving her cold and afraid. Still, she endured in silence. Her love for her unborn child became the only light she held on to. No matter how much her body hurt or how lonely her nights became, she told herself that she had to survive, because her child deserved to live in a world brighter than the one she was enduring. The day of the family gathering was supposed to be joyful. Relatives filled the courtyard with chatter and laughter, children ran around playing, and the smell of food filled the air. Amina, despite her tired body, did her best to serve everyone with a smile. She wanted to be seen as part of the family, to show kindness even when her own heart felt heavy. She hoped maybe, just maybe, Mama Rahima would soften in front of the guests. But hope quickly shattered. In the middle of the meal, while everyone was seated, Mama Rahima's voice rose above the laughter. Her words were sharp and deliberate, aimed straight at Amina. "This girl is nothing but a curse to this family," she declared. The room fell silent. Plates were set down, and eyes turned toward Amina. The shame burned in her chest like fire. Her hands trembled, and her throat tightened as if she could not breathe. For a moment, Amina searched for Daniel's face, desperate for him to speak, to defend her. But he stayed quiet, staring at the floor as though his voice had been stolen. That silence crushed her more than the insult itself. In that moment, she felt utterly alone. Unable to bear the weight of so many eyes on her, Amina stood and rushed to her. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable. She buried her head in her hands, her sobs shaking her entire body. The words "a curse" echoed again and again in her mind, each repetition breaking her a little more. How could she be a curse when all she had ever wanted was to love and to be loved? Sitting on the edge of her bed, she placed her hands over her stomach. The baby kicked gently, as if reminding her of its presence. Instead of joy, a deep fear filled her heart. What kind of world was she bringing her child into? Would her son or daughter grow up surrounded by the same hate that now suffocated? Would they too feel unwanted because of her? Her mind spiraled with questions that had no answers. She thought of her own family back in Kasongo, of how her mother had always told her she was a blessing, how quickly those words had been replaced by another woman's cruelty. For the first time, Amina began to doubt her worth, not just as a wife, but as a mother. The sounds of laughter returned outside, but they no longer reached her heart. Inside her room, she sat in silence, hugging her belly as though it was the only comfort left in the world. Her tears slowed, but the ache inside her remained. That night, Amina realized she was standing at a breaking point. She could no longer pretend the pain didn't exist. She loved her child deeply, but she wondered if love alone was strong enough to fight against so much hate. One evening, after another long day of harsh words and heavy chores, Amina sat quietly outside, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She tried to hide her tears, but her neighbor, Mama Nia, noticed. Mama Nia was a kind woman who had lived next door for many years. She often watched Amina from afar, her heart aching at the way she was treated. That night, when the house had grown quieter and Mama Rahima was distracted, Mama Nia slowly walked over and sat beside her. "Amina," she whispered gently, "you don't have to hide your pain from me." At first, Amina shook her head. She didn't want to burden anyone, and she feared Mama Rahima would find out. But when she looked into Mama Nia's eyes, she saw nothing but kindness. The tears she had been holding back spilled freely, and before she knew it, she was telling her everything: the insults, the endless work, the loneliness that ate away at her heart. Mama Nia listened without interrupting, her face filled with sorrow but also strength. When Amina finished, wiping her wet cheeks, Mama Nia reached out and held her hand. "My daughter," she said softly, "do not let their cruelty make you forget who you are. You are strong. You are a mother already, even before this child is born. And your child will one day be the light that silences all this darkness around you." Those words sank deep into Amina's heart. No one had spoken to her like that in so long. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be encouraged, to be seen as more than a burden. For the first time in many months, she felt a spark of hope inside her. She pressed Mama Nia's words to her chest like a treasure. The two women sat together for a while in silence, the night air cool around them. Amina whispered a quiet thank you, her voice shaky but sincere. Mama Nia smiled and squeezed her hand. "Endure, my child. Endure for your baby. One day you will see why all of this suffering was not in vain." That night, as Amina lay in bed, she thought of Mama Nia's words again and again. She still felt the weight of her struggles, but now there was something stronger inside her, something she had not felt in a long time: courage. She whispered to her unborn child, "You are my light. I will not give up, no matter what." The next morning, when Mama Rahima's sharp voice called her to work, Amina rose with quiet strength. She still carried the pain, but she no longer felt completely alone. She held on to Mama Nia's promise, believing that the child inside her was more than just her reason to live. It was her reason to hope. And that hope gave her the courage to endure. The night Amina went into labor was one she would never forget. The pains began slowly, sharp waves that made her clutch her stomach. At first, she thought she could bear it, but as the hours passed, the pain grew stronger, spreading through her body until she could hardly stand. Sweat covered her face, and her cries of agony filled the house. Instead of rushing to her side, Mama Rahima frowned from across the room. "She is pretending," she said coldly. "Women have been giving birth in this house for generations without doctors. She wants attention." Her words stung worse than the pain itself. Amina begged for help, tears streaming down her face, but Mama Rahima turned away, refusing to move. Daniel stood nearby, restless and confused. He could see his wife suffering, but his mother's voice still held power over him. "Maybe it is too early," he muttered, trying to convince himself. But deep down, he knew this was not a game. He saw the fear in Amina's eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clung to her belly. Still, he hesitated, torn between his love for his wife and his obedience to his mother. It was Mama Nia who finally acted. She had heard Amina's cries from her own house and rushed over. The moment she saw Amina's condition, she knew there was no time to waste. Without asking for permission, she ran out into the night, calling for help, her voice breaking through the silence of the village. A few neighbors responded, and together they hurried to bring a midwife and a doctor. Inside the house, Amina's strength was fading. She whispered prayers between screams, clutching onto the hope that her baby would survive even if she did not. Her body shook violently, and her vision blurred, but she refused to give up. She thought of Mama Nia's words, "Your child will be the light." She held on to that promise like a lifeline. When the doctor arrived, everything moved quickly. They laid Amina down, giving her the care she desperately needed. Hours felt like days, but finally, the piercing cry of a newborn filled the room. A baby boy had entered the world, alive and strong. Tears rolled down Amina's face as she held him against her chest, her pain replaced with overwhelming relief. For a moment, even Mama Rahima was silent. The sound of the baby's cry broke through her hardened heart, but she said nothing. Daniel, on the other hand, felt shame wash over him. He realized how close he had come to losing both his wife and his child because he had allowed fear and obedience to silence him. He looked at Amina, pale and exhausted but radiant with love as she held their son, and guilt filled his heart. That night, as the baby slept in Amina's arms, Daniel sat quietly beside her. He knew he could never undo his failure, but he also knew he had to change. For the first time, he saw clearly where his loyalty belonged, not in his mother's shadow, but beside the woman who had fought through pain and neglect to bring their child into the world. The moment the baby's first cry filled the room, everything seemed to stop. It was a sharp, strong sound, one that carried life and hope in every breath. Amina, exhausted and drenched in sweat, felt her heart swell the instant she heard it. She reached out weakly, and when the tiny bundle was placed in her arms, she pressed him close to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, not from pain this time, but from the overwhelming joy of knowing her child was alive. Daniel, standing beside her, was struck speechless. He stared at his son, his lips trembling as guilt and pride tangled inside him. That cry reminded him of what truly mattered, his wife, his child, and the love he had nearly lost. For the first time, he realized how blind he had been, listening to his mother's harshness while ignoring his wife's suffering. He reached out, brushing his fingers gently across the baby's tiny hand, his heart aching with both regret and wonder. And then there was Mama Rahima. She stood frozen in the corner, her face pale as the cry of the newborn echoed through the house. Something inside her shifted, something she had buried long ago. She remembered her own days as a young mother, when she too had struggled and cried in secret, feeling alone and unappreciated. The sound of that small cry pulled out memories she had tried to silence. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the fear of not being enough. Tears welled in her eyes, uninvited, sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. For the first time since Amina entered her home, Mama Rahima looked at her with different eyes. She no longer saw just a young woman she thought unworthy of her son. She saw a mother, a woman who had fought with all her strength to bring life into the world. She saw herself reflected in Amina, and in that reflection, her cruelty felt heavy and shameful. The room, which had always been filled with harsh words and cold glances, now felt softened by the baby's voice. Even the neighbors who had gathered outside the house to hear the news whispered prayers of gratitude, their faces lit with relief. Inside, Amina held her son close, rocking him gently, her lips brushing his forehead as she whispered promises of love and protection. Daniel finally spoke, his voice breaking. "You've given me the greatest gift," he said, looking at Amina with tears in his eyes. His hand rested on her shoulder, steady and sure, as if vowing silently never to let her down again. Mama Rahima, still wiping her tears, stepped closer. She didn't speak, not yet, but the hardness in her eyes had faded. She watched Amina with the baby, and for the first time, her gaze was soft, almost tender. The cry of that newborn had done what nothing else could. It had broken through walls of bitterness and begun to awaken something long buried inside her, compassion. The morning after the baby's birth, the house was filled with a different kind of silence. It wasn't the heavy silence of anger or judgment, but a quiet that carried reflection. Amina sat on the bed, cradling her newborn, humming softly to him. Daniel sat nearby, watching her with eyes full of guilt and love. For once, the air between them felt gentle. But in the corner of the room stood Mama Rahima, her face heavy with emotions she could no longer hide. When the rest of the family gathered later that day to see the baby, Mama Rahima did something no one expected. She stood before them, her voice trembling, and spoke words that shocked everyone. "I have been cruel," she said, her eyes fixed on Amina. "I treated her with hate, when all she showed me was respect. My heart was filled with bitterness, and I let jealousy blind me. I thought no one would be good enough for my son. I thought she had taken him away from me, but I was wrong. She has given this family a blessing I do not deserve." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she covered her face with her hand. The woman who had always stood strong and harsh was suddenly broken, her pain visible to all. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of her confession hanging in the air. Then all eyes turned to Amina. Amina, holding her baby close, felt her own tears fall. She had suffered deeply under Mama Rahima's cruelty, but in that moment, she saw not a monster, but a woman who had been trapped in her own wounds. Slowly, she stood up, her body still weak, and walked toward her mother-in-law. "I forgive you," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "Not for me, but for him." She glanced down at the baby in her arms. "He deserves to grow up in love, not in hate." The family watched as Amina leaned forward and allowed Mama Rahima to see the baby more closely. Mama Rahima's hands shook as she reached out to touch the child, her tears falling onto his tiny blanket. In that moment, the walls she had built around her heart crumbled completely. She whispered, "Thank you," her voice cracking with emotion. Daniel stepped forward then, his heart heavy with guilt. He placed his hand on Amina's shoulder and spoke in front of everyone. I failed you, he admitted, his voice breaking. I chose silence when I should have defended you. I let my mother's voice be louder than my love for you. But never again. I promise, from this day forward, I will stand by you, no matter what. Amina looked at him, her eyes tired but filled with hope. She nodded, clutching her baby tightly as if sealing that promise in her heart. The family, moved by the scene, wiped their own tears. What had once been a house of bitterness was now filled with something new, healing. And it all began with forgiveness. The days that followed were filled with joy and warmth the house had not known for a long time. Relatives came to see the baby, bringing gifts and songs, and for the first time, Amina felt truly welcome. The little boy was celebrated as a blessing, his tiny cries bringing smiles to everyone's faces. Laughter replaced whispers, and love replaced the bitterness that once filled the walls. Mama Rahima changed more than anyone could have imagined. She no longer spoke harshly to Amina. Instead, she became her strongest supporter, watching over her with a protectiveness that surprised the whole family. When neighbors came, she proudly introduced Amina as her daughter, not just her son's wife. She carried the baby in her arms with pride, as though he had healed wounds she had carried for years. For Amina, the transformation felt like a miracle. She still carried the memories of her suffering, but now they felt lighter, softened by forgiveness and the new love that surrounded her. At night, as she rocked her baby to sleep, she leaned close and whispered, "You are the reason love won over hate. You are my miracle." Her words were tender, filled with gratitude for the light he had brought into her darkest days. Daniel stood by her, no longer silent, no longer torn between two worlds. He had learned where his heart belonged, and together, he and Amina began building the family they had once dreamed of. The story of their struggle and healing spread quietly through the community, a reminder that kindness and endurance can turn even the hardest hearts. And in the middle of it all, a child's first cry had been the spark that lit the way.